General Hospital spoilers reveal that Michael Corinthos had never imagined he would one day be forced to turn his back on the woman he once loved in order to protect the children they had once promised to raise together. But the lines had been drawn, the damage had been done, and with Willow Tate choosing to tether herself to Drew Kane, both emotionally and legally, Michael knew there was no turning back. The choice Willow made to bind her life to Drew's was not just about love or companionship, it was about loyalty, allegiance, and trust. And she had placed her trust in the one man Michael considered the greatest danger to the lives of Wiley and Amelia. For Michael, this wasn't about jealousy or revenge. It was about survival, his children's survival. Every decision Drew made reeked of control, manipulation, and veiled coercion. And Michael could not bear the thought of his children being shaped by such hands. So he moved swiftly, ruthlessly, and with precision that stunned even his closest allies. He went to the one person he believed still understood him, the one woman who had lost just as much as he had, if not more, Sasha Corbin. Their history was complicated, lined with scars from grief, betrayal, and fractured love. But what bound them now was not romance, it was purpose. Michael didn't come to Sasha offering dreams or asking for forgiveness. He came to her with a proposition born not from passion but from a desperate need to preserve everything that mattered to him. He asked her to marry him, not for love, but for legal leverage. He needed to present to the court a vision of stability, unity, and maternal care, one Drew and Willow could no longer claim to provide. Sasha hesitated. She had learned the hard way that love, promises, and plans could all dissolve into tragedy. But Michael's plea wasn't veiled in sentiment. He laid bare the reality: if they stood together, they could create a foundation that the courts would trust. He offered her protection for Daisy, a real home, and a voice in raising all 3 children. In return, he asked for her name beside his on the legal documents that would decide the fate of his family. Sasha understood the stakes. She had watched Willow descend into an illusion with Drew, believing that marriage to a man with blood-stained intentions could somehow create a clean start. Sasha had seen through Drew's polished charm, the same way she had once seen through her own pain. She agreed to the marriage, setting conditions that would allow her to preserve her independence and guard her daughter's future. Their engagement was quiet, efficient, but when it became public, the shockwave spread. Willow, already vulnerable, was crushed by the news. What she had dismissed as a desperate threat from Michael had now become her nightmare. Michael wasn't trying to intimidate her, he was replacing her. Drew's response was more calculated. He assured Willow that Michael's marriage to Sasha was a performance, an act to sway the court, but inside, he knew the threat was real. And for the first time, Drew's carefully controlled demeanor cracked. He began pushing harder, urging Willow to discredit Sasha, to question Michael's stability, to paint herself as the victim. But the more he pushed, the more Willow started to see him. Not the hero who had offered her protection, but the manipulator who had constructed a prison around her disguised as safety. She thought she was escaping the pain of her marriage to Michael, but now she was trapped in an alliance that felt even colder. Meanwhile, Michael continued assembling his case. With Carly's support, Jason's quiet surveillance of Drew's business ties, and Sunny's pressure in the background, Michael presented a home that was safe, secure, and consistent. Sasha's testimony to the court was raw and unflinching. She had once suffered the loss of a child, and she would not stand by while another mother allowed selfishness and control to dictate her child's life. Her presence beside Michael was not only convincing but emotionally grounded. And the judge, reading through the files of Drew's coercive actions, including evidence of tampering with Willow's travel arrangements to Germany, began to lean toward a decision that would shatter the balance. The courtroom became a theater of emotional unraveling. Drew was exposed for forging alliances with Sidwell, manipulating court officials, and offering bribes to block visitation rights. Willow's credibility collapsed under cross-examination, and her association with Drew rendered her fitness for sole custody deeply questionable. The judge ruled in Michael's favor, awarding him full custody of Wiley and Amelia, with supervised visitation extended to Willow under strict conditions. Sasha would be legally recognized as their stepmother. And Daisy would be raised alongside them in a home that the court deemed emotionally stable. Willow's breakdown was silent but devastating. She had believed she was fighting for her children. But in truth, she had been fighting her own shame, her need to escape the pain Michael had left in her. In running from it, she had run into the arms of a man whose hunger for control had stripped her of everything she thought she could preserve. Michael did not revel in her defeat, but he also didn't offer comfort. This was not an act of vengeance. It was a defense, a final act of fatherhood driven to the edge. As Drew's empire began to crumble under separate investigations, and his allies started to defect, Sunny and Jason stood quietly in the wings, making sure nothing could threaten the children again. Michael had transformed. He was no longer the idealistic son of Carly and Sunny. He was his own force now, strategic, unrelenting, and willing to destroy anything that endangered his family. He married Sasha in a quiet ceremony attended only by their children and closest confidants. There were no speeches, no dances, no promises of forever. Just a vow to protect what mattered. And Willow, now alone, began to see the truth too late. The man she had trusted had built her cage. And the man she had left had found a way to rise from betrayal and heartbreak to build a fortress she could no longer enter. She stood on the outside of a life she had once called her own. Watching through the glass as someone else raised her children, someone kinder, steadier, and more willing to fight than she had ever been. Sasha and Michael's relationship had once been a chapter they both thought closed, a memory buried beneath years of trauma, shattered trust, and separate paths carved through pain. Yet what had initially been broken between them now re-emerged not only intact but reborn, forged in the fire of mutual loss and fierce protectiveness over the children who had become their center. It didn't happen suddenly, nor was it a reckless return to old patterns. Instead, it unfolded slowly and deliberately, like a storm gathering on the horizon, undeniable, inescapable, and transformative. Their rekindled bond was no longer about romance in the conventional sense, but about legacy, stability, and a kind of love that could no longer be shaken by whispers, doubts, or the ghosts of former lovers. Michael had watched Willow walk away, not just once but repeatedly, each time with more finality, more defiance, until her decisions left scars too deep to ignore. And yet, even when he offered her a path back, she chose to reject it, blinded by her trust in Drew and unwilling to believe that her world was unraveling at the seams. That rejection didn't just sever what remained of their love, it hardened something in Michael. It transformed his heartbreak into cold calculation. It made him realize that the only way forward, the only way to protect Wiley and Amelia from the chaos Willow and Drew carried, was to eliminate any legal, emotional, or moral justification they might have to remain in the children's lives. And to do that, he needed more than court documents or testimonies. He needed a partner who understood what was at stake. He needed Sasha. Sasha, too, had changed. Her experiences with addiction, grief, and manipulation had turned her into someone steelier, more resolute, and yet still capable of profound tenderness. When Michael approached her with the proposition of marriage, not out of love, but out of necessity, she didn't recoil. She studied him carefully, saw through the cracks in his armor, and recognized the truth: he wasn't trying to trap her or control her. He was trying to build a shield strong enough to withstand the storm that Drew and Willow had unleashed. And in that moment, she knew she had the power to shape not only her own future, but the future of the children she had come to love as her own. Daisy was her blood, but Wiley and Amelia had become hers through presence, care, and sacrifice. The proposal wasn't a candlelit moment filled with promises of forever. It was a strategic pact between two survivors. Michael offered her legal protection, emotional safety, and the resources to raise Daisy without fear. Sasha, in turn, offered him credibility in court, stability in the home, and a soft power that no judge could ignore. Together, they would present a united, competent, and loving front that stood in stark contrast to the instability of Drew's violent outbursts and Willow's erratic behavior. But even as the arrangement began in logic, it didn't stay there for long. The walls they built around themselves to keep the past out began to crumble in each other's presence. Nights once filled with legal strategy became moments of shared vulnerability. Michael began to smile again. Sasha began to dream again. The children began to laugh more freely. No longer sensing tension but security in the home they were building. But not everyone was ready to embrace this new chapter. Willow, driven by desperation and a crumbling identity, saw their union as betrayal. Drew, paranoid and unraveling, saw it as an act of war. Together, they launched a campaign to undermine Michael and Sasha, fabricating claims, bribing insiders, and trying to expose cracks that no longer existed. But every attempt only strengthened Michael's resolve. He wasn't just defending a legal position anymore, he was defending the life he had rebuilt. The family he had chosen, and the woman who had walked back into his world not to save him, but to stand beside him. Jason watched from the shadows, torn between loyalty to Michael and concern over how far his brother was willing to go. Sonny, too, remained distant but observant, aware that Michael was no longer the idealistic boy he once raised, but a man shaped by betrayal, vengeance, and an unyielding sense of justice. Still, both men knew better than to intervene. This was Michael's war, and he was fighting it not out of pride but out of duty. Wiley and Amelia were no longer just children, they were the symbols of everything he refused to lose. And so the alliance between Michael and Sasha grew stronger. In public, they smiled politely at fundraisers, school events, and courtroom appearances. In private, they navigated the complexities of shared pain and the intimacy of starting over. Every step they took together rewrote their story. One that no longer centered on past mistakes but on future resilience. They were no longer broken people hoping to feel whole again. They were architects of their destiny, drawing blueprints in the ashes of what had been destroyed. Drew and Willow, meanwhile, spiraled. Their marriage, once seen as a strategic move to reclaim control, revealed itself as a hollow fortress built on lies. Their plans began to unravel in court, as more and more evidence surfaced of Drew's manipulation and Willow's negligence. Judges began to side with Michael. Caseworkers began to note the differences in emotional stability between the two homes. And as the legal tide turned, so did public opinion. The community that once rallied behind Drew and Willow now watched silently, ashamed of ever believing in the illusion they had presented. In the end, it was Sasha who delivered the final blow, not out of vengeance, but clarity. In her testimony, she didn't speak of betrayal or pain. She spoke of love, consistency, and the quiet power of presence. She painted a portrait of a family that had emerged not from perfection, but from perseverance. And when the gavel struck, awarding full custody to Michael, it wasn't just a victory in court, it was a vindication of everything they had built. And yet, even in triumph, Michael remained haunted. Not because he regretted his choices, but because he had seen firsthand how easily love could twist into weaponized loyalty. He looked at Sasha not as a prize, but as a mirror, someone who had survived the worst and chosen to keep going. Their marriage, once born out of necessity, now stood as proof that redemption wasn't just possible, it was worth fighting for. And as they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, their children racing ahead, laughter echoing off the marble floors, Michael realized that sometimes, the most powerful families aren't those defined by blood, but by the choice to never walk away. No matter how deep the scars. Sasha had once been content to stand on the sidelines, choosing peace over power, healing over retaliation, but those days were over. The trauma she had endured, the loss, the humiliation, the manipulation, had transformed her into a woman unwilling to watch her future be dictated by people who only saw her as a stepping stone in their own twisted narratives. Now, she was stepping into the light with unapologetic determination, ready to claim every right, every position, every ounce of stability that had ever been denied to her. And in doing so, she was prepared to dismantle the delusions Drew and Willow had so recklessly built their lives upon. What Sasha sought was not revenge, it was restoration. But to others, especially to Willow, It looked like theft. Willow, once seen as the innocent mother torn between love and duty, was now barreling towards self-destruction. Blinded by her faith in Drew and deaf to the growing warnings around her. Her determination to marry Drew had hardened into obsession. She was convinced that this marriage would unlock the path to reclaiming custody of Wiley and Amelia, even as the world around her began to whisper doubts about Drew's true motives. She clung to the wedding like it was a lifeline, ignoring the fact that it was actually the chain pulling her further down into the abyss. Sasha saw it clearly, the danger Willow represented not just to the children but to herself. And as Michael began to chart a new path for his family, Sasha became more than just his partner. She became his co-strategist, his moral compass, and eventually, the unexpected force willing to strike back when Willow and Drew moved to undermine them. The more Willow doubled down on her impending marriage, the more Sasha prepared to assert her place in the children's lives, not as a replacement, but as a guardian of truth, stability, and hard-earned trust. The courtroom was no longer just a place for custody arguments, it was the battlefield for an emotional war, where every whispered conversation, every memory, every betrayal was weaponized. Sasha didn't raise her voice or sling mud. She didn't need to. Her very presence, her resilience, her undeniable growth in the face of unimaginable pain, that was her leverage. She calculated each move with precision, ensuring that every legal decision and public appearance added to the mounting pressure pushing Willow and Drew into collapse. But what no one could have anticipated was how deeply this battle would scar them all. For Willow, watching Sasha step into the role she believed was rightfully hers was a wound that festered by the hour. Her identity, as a mother, a wife, a woman who had survived leukemia and loss, was now under threat from a woman she had once pitied. And in her desperation, Willow began making dangerous decisions, surrounding herself with people who reinforced her delusions instead of grounding her in reality. Meanwhile, Drew, sensing control slipping away, leaned into manipulation. He crafted elaborate lies, tried to frame Sasha as unstable, and even attempted to create doubt around Michael's fitness as a father. But each tactic backfired. The more Drew tried to distort the narrative, the more the court, and the public, began to see who he truly was, a man fueled not by love, but by obsession and a need for control. And at the heart of this growing scandal, Sasha stood unshaken. Her quiet strength casting a shadow longer than anyone could have predicted. And then came the moment no one expected, when Sasha turned the tables entirely. She made a public statement. Not in anger, but with clarity and grace, declaring her intention to adopt a more permanent role in Wiley and Amelia's lives. She cited her bond with them, her love, her responsibility, and yes, her belief that they deserved to grow up without the constant upheaval of betrayal and instability. It was a bold move. It was a calculated move. It was a move that shattered whatever hope Willow still had of regaining her children through sympathy or illusion. What followed was a media frenzy. Journalists latched onto the story of the woman once declared too fragile to raise her own child now stepping in to protect others. Public sentiment shifted. Donations to the Corinthos Foundation skyrocketed. And behind closed doors, the judge began re-evaluating the terms of visitation rights. Spurred by mounting evidence that Willow's current environment, wrapped in Drew's paranoia and lies, was anything but suitable. But this wasn't just about legal victories. It was about reclaiming narrative. Sasha had been reduced to headlines for years, a tragic widow, a former addict, a woman too broken to parent. But now, she was writing a new story, one where she was no one's victim, no one's afterthought, and certainly no longer the woman left behind. Still, the cost was high. The tension between Willow and Sasha reached a boiling point. They crossed paths in public, tense stares, venomous words beneath forced smiles. Willow accused Sasha of stealing her life. Sasha, calm and composed, responded only with the truth. She had stepped in when Willow walked away. And when Willow tried to rally supporters, old friends, former allies, many of them quietly stepped back, unwilling to get involved in a war they no longer believed she could win. Michael, meanwhile, watched it all unfold with both pride and pain. He never wanted this. He had hoped for cooperation, shared custody, peace. But Willow's choices, her refusal to see who Drew really was, her denial of Michael's sincerity, her belief that a wedding could undo years of damage, had made that impossible. And now, the woman standing beside him was not only proving her worth but giving the children the stability and warmth they had long been deprived of. Jason and Sunny, too, kept their distance but remained aware. They recognized the storm brewing, the fault lines in Port Charles shifting. This wasn't just a custody battle, it was a referendum on legacy, trust, and survival. And as Willow prepared to walk down the aisle with Drew, convinced that love alone would fix everything, the rest of the world prepared to move on without her. Because in the end, it was never about titles or bloodlines. It was about who showed up, who stayed, who protected the vulnerable when it mattered most. And in that regard, Sasha had already won. Michael and Sasha were no longer just two individuals scarred by loss and betrayal, they were becoming something far more formidable. As the chaos of the custody battle deepened and the town of Port Charles watched the implosion of Willow and Drew's alliance, Michael and Sasha began to emerge as the new power couple no one saw coming. Their bond, once rooted in shared grief, had evolved into a quiet but unbreakable trust, a partnership built not on illusion or desperation, but on survival, strategy, and a deep commitment to the children at the center of their world. This transformation signaled more than just emotional recovery. It marked a seismic shift in the social and political landscape of Port Charles. And it sent shockwaves through everyone who once underestimated them. The moment Michael and Sasha began appearing publicly together, united at charity galas, holding hands in courtroom hallways, exchanging knowing glances as reporters circled, it became clear that their alignment was more than legal. It was symbolic. It declared that they were no longer reacting to pain, they were using it. Every calculated move they made was in service of creating a stable future, not just for Wiley and Amelia, but for Daisy as well. And the message was clear, anyone threatening that stability, whether it be Drew, Willow, or even Nina, would be met with quiet, devastating resistance. For Michael, this partnership gave him the clarity and purpose he had lacked in his fractured relationship with Willow. With Sasha, there were no more manipulative arguments, no gaslighting, no psychological warfare. There was only truth. And that truth became a foundation for strength, drawing attention from both allies and enemies. The courtimanes, long skeptical of Sasha, began to take notice. Sunny, watching from the shadows, recognized the same ruthlessness he once nurtured in Michael. Even Carly, ever protective of her son, saw Sasha not as a threat to her family, but as its future. Meanwhile, the community's perception began to shift. Sasha, long dismissed as a fragile survivor, was now being seen as a resilient protector. Her grace in the courtroom, her devotion to Daisy, her quiet support of Michael, it all became part of a narrative the public couldn't ignore. Media outlets, once eager to sensationalize her breakdowns, now ran headlines about her comeback, her courage, her fight. And with each article, each whisper of admiration, the power of the Michael-Sasha duo grew. But this newfound prominence came with shadows. Drew, watching from the sidelines, grew increasingly unhinged. His schemes unraveling as Michael and Sasha continued to win over the court of public opinion. Willow, meanwhile, began spiraling. Her belief that she could reclaim her children by marrying Drew crumbled as the judge's tone shifted in favor of Michael's new family unit. The more Willow clung to her version of control, the more isolated she became, unable to compete with the quiet strength Sasha exuded. What shocked everyone most was the intensity of the bond growing between Michael and Sasha, not just emotionally, but psychologically. They began to mirror each other in ways that were almost haunting, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating one another's legal moves, responding to attacks with synchronized precision. It was a kind of partnership that couldn't be faked, a fusion of shared trauma and ambition that turned them into something more than just a couple. They were a force. And that force was unsettling. Nina, once so sure of her ability to manipulate outcomes from behind the scenes, found herself cornered. Tracy and Ned, once skeptical of Sasha's influence, now saw her as the stabilizing link in Michael's ascent. Even Jason, ever the quiet guardian of his family, began to see that Sasha's role in Michael's life was not temporary, it was transformative. Still, beneath their calm exterior, there was something deeper, something darker, fueling this rise. It wasn't just about love or even protection. It was about taking control of a world that had once discarded them. About rewriting the rules that had always favored the loudest voices. The bloodiest battles. Michael and Sasha weren't just reacting, they were calculating. Every legal move, every custody filing, every public appearance was a step toward total dominance of their narrative. And in doing so, they were proving that their trauma had forged something dangerous. A couple who knew how to weaponize perception, loyalty, and legacy. In private, Sasha was still healing. The nightmares hadn't gone away. The memories of losing Liam, of being drugged and manipulated, of being seen as weak, they still lingered. But Michael understood that pain. He didn't try to fix it or erase it. He simply stood beside her, unwavering. And that solidarity, that patience, became the cornerstone of their ascent. What began as an emotional refuge had become a political storm. And Port Charles was not ready. Because Michael and Sasha were not interested in being pitted or praised, they were interested in winning. And their definition of victory extended far beyond a custody ruling. It meant security, influence, legacy. It meant making sure that people like Drew and Willow could never again endanger the lives they were building. As their names began to echo through courtrooms, media outlets, and boardrooms alike, it became undeniable. Michael and Sasha were the new power couple of Port Charles. And what made them most terrifying was that they didn't seek power for its own sake. They sought it because they knew what happened when good people didn't fight back. They sought it to protect what mattered most. And in that pursuit, they were willing to go farther than anyone had imagined, even if it meant burying the past, burning bridges, and making enemies of those they once loved. Because in the end, Michael and Sasha were no longer just rebuilding their lives, they were reshaping the town itself. And anyone standing in their way would either bow down, or be broken.